Some are grand and spectacular, others cosy and intimate. Some have been extensively restored, others are in a gentle process of decay. But whether you're a keen practical gardener or you just like looking at beautiful things, you can't help but enjoy wandering around in the gardens of Cornwall. It's a mixture of climate and geography that makes these gardens work so well. The Cornish Peninsula, a long, thin finger of land jutting into the Atlantic. That's a real advantage because warm currents coming up from the Caribbean, that's the Gulf Stream, bring with them warm, moist air, perfect for plant growing. But there's a downside: wind. It howls over the top of Cornwall, turning all the uplands into blasted heaths. But down here in the combes, sheltered from the wind, exotic plants like arums and tree ferns can thrive in still air while the gales hurtle across overhead. It's more than just a favourable climate that makes these gardens so special. With its strong seafaring tradition, it isn't surprising that plant treasures from all around the world have fetched up here. When 19th century plant collector John Tresco discovered land adjacent to the church at St Just in Roseland, he knew he had the perfect spot for nurturing his developing collection. Since then, the churchyard has expanded, and Tresco's plants still thrive among the gravestones. Whenever you travel in Cornwall, you're constantly aware of the natural beauty, from honeysuckle and wild roses in the hedgerows, buttercups and herb robert growing on the banks, and drifts of foxglove sometimes filling the ancient pastures. And the natural flora permeates all the gardens we will be visiting, as well as the wild habitats. There's such a rich variety of landscapes, from small sheltered villages with their streams to wide open spaces. For this programme, we've selected gardens that reflect the enormous choice of growing conditions that Cornwall has to offer. But perhaps the most typical Cornish setting is this ravine garden at Trebah. The 25-acre garden drops down to the Helford estuary and is the retirement home of Tony Hibbert, or so he thought when he first moved here.
The secretary of the Cornwall Garden Society persuaded us to give up the first 3 years of our retirement to restore the garden, and he said at least it would give us a nice view while we were drinking our gin for the rest of our retirement. Of course, he was lying through his teeth. That was 15 years ago. There's still another 15 years of hard work to complete it. It is, in my view, one of the most beautiful gardens I've ever seen. We're doing our best every year to make it even more beautiful, but not in a conventional way. We're trying to create a great, wild, natural Cornish garden with the emphasis on beauty and enchantment. And I think it's working.
And he's addressed another problem, extending the season of interest beyond spring. For example, by planting this bold drift of mophead hydrangeas. These will flower from June right through till the end of autumn, gradually changing colour from intense blue when they first come out until they gently fade for winter. Tender exotics thrive here too, like these Dixonias, stately tree ferns from Tasmania, although these would thrive in other parts of the British Isles as long as it's not too frosty. And Gunnera from South America, making a huge bed with leaves sometimes exceeding 6 foot across. And from China, bamboos, but here in Cornwall they grow several times as high as they might anywhere else in Britain. Every garden benefits from water, but if you're blessed with a natural stream, the possibilities are enormous. At Trebah, a waterfall tumbles down into a pool stocked with 30-year-old koi carp. And beyond, the stream leads into a water garden planted with arum lilies, 3,000 of them, and drifts of candelabra primulas in red and yellow and soft warm orange. As for the future, unlike some gardens which run into jeopardy when their owners give them up, this one is held in trust so it can be enjoyed for generations to come. Magical when it rains, and it does rain rather a lot in Cornwall, but when the sun comes out over the Helford River, you can see why this is a treasure that must be preserved. Most of these gardens have strong historical links, particularly from the great plant hunters. This magnificent Davidia involucrata, the dove tree, for example, is named after Père David, a Jesuit missionary in China, but it was actually collected from there by Ernest Wilson. Wilson was one of the many plant hunters who brought such a wealth of species from China. And from Japan, as well as camellias, there are thriving here Pyrrhus forestii, named after George Forrest, known not only for the lily of the valley flowers, but also the lovely red foliage as it emerges in spring. And also enjoying this acid soil and very high rainfall, rhododendrons, courtesy of that great family, the hookahs. And to underplant the rhododendrons and spring-flowering shrubs, daffodils. In Cornwall they used to grow fields of daffodils, sending them up on the early train to catch the market. But that was when Covent Garden was really at Covent Garden and before international air freight changed the nature of the industry. Nowadays Cornish daffodil fields are fewer and further between, but you can still find them, and in gardens they're naturalised everywhere. Several of today's daffodil varieties were the result of breeding programmes earlier this century, and can be seen growing wild at Cahays. It was also here that much pioneering work was done in introducing and hybridizing new plants from China and India. J.C. Williams, owner of Cahays, produced many new hybrid rhododendrons, but is perhaps best known for crossing two camellia species, both beautiful in their own right. This is Camellia japonica, and this one, Camellia saluanensis. These cross to produce a hardy and dependable hybrid, Camellia williamsi, and Donation is probably the best known. But there are plenty more, and all of them suitable for planting anywhere in the UK. But gardening at Cahays hasn't always been plain sailing.
In 1914, everybody suddenly realised that the Chinese plants were going to do well out of doors, and at Cahays in particular. And they were gradually coming down. The RHS was sending down delegations and that sort of thing. And in July of 1914, the great visitor from Moore, Professor Sargent from the Arnold Arboretum, came over and spent 3 days touring Cornish gardens. And then, bingo, a week later, war. And that absolutely kiboshed everything. And the garden staff was getting depleted. In fact, so bad was it that in July 1918, the head gardener, Mr. Fitt, received his calling up papers, and my grandfather rather sadly said to his son, he said, we're down to a one-legged chap, a wounded soldier, who's the only chap dealing with all this. Grandfather died in 1939, his son Charles Williams, Member of Parliament for Torquay, etc. He took on, and again 6 months later the war came. All the young people went off, and the people running the garden were a lot of very old gentlemen who moved very, very well, very loyally, but very slowly. And if plants grow well, the weeds will grow well. And the brambles here, when they really get going, are prize winners. So when Uncle Charles used to come back from the night sleeper train, dash into his old clothes, to take out his scythe, and off he went to cut the garden. And if he hadn't done that, I think we'd have lost it.
But of course, despite everything, the gardens at Cahays continue to thrive thanks to the energy of the Williams family and the support of their head gardeners, who have helped to continue the tradition of breeding new varieties. Philip Tregunner worked with the family here for 40 years, and he's rightly proud of his achievements at breeding magnolias.
He's even had one named after himself.
I made the cross in 1959 and we planted out here in 1965 and it first flowered in 1970. In 1993 we took it up to the RHS and they gave it a first class certificate, which is the highest award you can get, and confirmed that it would be called Filtergunna.
It's probably far too large for your average front garden, but how wonderful seeing these magnolias growing up to 80 foot high and covered in blooms each the size of a gallon bucket. Even today, seed is being brought back from plant hunting expeditions and grown on both here at Cahays and by another generation of Williams at Burncoose nurseries a few miles inland.
Burncoose has been in the Williams family since 1715, so for over 100 years the two gardens have been run very much in tandem, with very much the same plants coming into the gardens and being to have grown up in both gardens in much the same way. Burncoose is much smaller than Cahays, it's very much more exposed, and we're on top of a hill, so one can't actually grow as wide a range of the tender things as one can at Cahays.
Nurseryman David Nucky at Burncoose is a regular gold medal winner at Chelsea and has been raising plants at the nursery for many years.
We do a lot of propagation. We're probably one of the few nurseries that exist that still do a lot of their own propagation. We probably propagate 60% of our own production. Camellias alone we probably do 20 or 30,000 plants a year. The same probably with rhododendrons and azaleas. Hydrangeas is a big crop for us. We do a lot of hydrangeas. And all the miscellaneous things which we can't get elsewhere and we propagate ourselves. Usually from stock taken from this garden. The house and garden is about 30 acres here. Under cultivation is probably about 15.
This is Azalea Cahays lavender. It's a most extraordinary plant. It's the only azalea that I know of which has pure white new growth. New growth turns green eventually, but at this time of the year it's really quite a staggering sight to see the mauve flowers set around by what looks like white leaves. And as you can see, the very newer growth is pure white, and it goes a little bit creamy yellow, and finally in about maybe a month or 6 weeks' time it'll revert to green. But that's quite extraordinary because you've got two big pluses from one fairly straightforward azalea plant. Bamboos are particularly suited to the high rainfall which we get in Cornwall, which encourages them to spread and develop very quickly. Burncoose has always had a very fine collection of bamboos, and in the 1930s it was recorded that there were over 80 species here. Today we can muster between 20 and 30 only, possibly because cold winters have killed them, possibly because, as we all know, bamboos seed and die, many varieties doing so every 40 to 60 years. And also the botanists have been changing names like Fury and amalgamating two different varieties and calling them one. So whether the numbers have actually declined as much as I would have just said, I think is open to some doubt. We have here a very large clump of Azalea shinsekai, which is a Japanese azalea. It's an evergreen, and it's planted in bulk for effect, for a big, bold, bland effect. Some might say rather a vulgar effect, but I leave that to personal opinion. It's certainly dramatic, and it's a plant that one can cut and cut and cut, and it will grow on and still produce a good show of flowers in the following year. Many a time has this been to the Chelsea Flower Show.
From quiet waters at Burncoose to more quiet waters at Chiverton, where the hunger for new plants from abroad has resulted in another fascinating collection so typical of Cornwall.
In 1770, Chiverton was inherited by John Thomas, and he, very soon after he took over, he dammed a small stream, created the lake you see below me, built the bridge and planted trees. And this forms now the backdrop to the garden that my father started to create in 1925. It is a sort of combination between the late 18th century and the 20th century. The pH is 5.4, which means that we can grow all the acid-loving plants. I don't cultivate, I just plant the things, talk to them, and if they do, I like them. We also, in the middle of the valley, have a lot of bog, and this is where we grow a lot of exotics like Lysichitum, particularly the skunk cabbage, which does exceptionally well and seeds down and is now spreading down the valley towards Perranporth and will arrive there in about the year 2000. But I suppose my main speciality over the years has become magnolias. Well, this is Magnolia Leonard Messel, which I found to be remarkably hardy. In fact, it will stand up to 5 degrees of frost. And this is just coming out when it has this sort of this rather lovely colour. And it's one I've recommended in the past as being the best magnolia for the smaller garden. This is Magnolia cylindrica from China, one of my favourites. Very free flowering and a very pretty white and not too big. The whole garden is full of weeds, and the fact that it's all weed, you don't notice them. If you have a flower bed and you see a little weed in the middle, by Jove, there's a weed, but the fact I don't use any sprays at all in the garden, no gramoxone or Roundup, anything, and I get into trouble from various now garden lecturers who tell their students that they must spray around their young plants with gramoxone. I never have, and I seem to get away with it. But it has created the sort of character of the garden. In fact, it is very natural. I feel I'm greener than most. In 1958, my father ordered Magnolia Campbelli from Helios, and it was planted here. That's the pink, which takes normally 30 years to flower. And 10 years after, that a branch from an oak behind fell down and smashed the tree, and the scion broke away from the rootstock, and this is the rootstock, which flowered about 10 years ago and proved to be one of the most beautiful magnolias in the world, and the most purest white. And it was named in honour of Sir Harold Hillier, who was head of the firm when my father purchased it, and who was arguably the greatest plantsman this sort of century. And interestingly, that the first gardener he advised back 70 years ago was my father. So it has a very, very close association, not only with Helios, but with Trebah. I took over the garden 40 years ago, and despite having virtually no help, it's doubled in size in a way, because I've carved little holes out of the woods and plant up. So each area is, in fact, is separate. And I can recognise now 29 gardens within the garden. But the main thing is shelter. I think that wind is our greatest menace in Cornwall, and that the more shelter you can create within the garden, the better.
This is an Elizabeth Holman, named after my wife who died just over 2 years ago. And it's a chant seedling that appeared in this garden. Arguably, I think it's one of the most beautiful camellias that I know, and that it is a sort of new break in colour. And I hope that when the new millennium, it will become a very popular variety.
Rhododendron maccabeanum, a monster, but what a lovely one. Not totally frost hardy, but how dramatic with its huge lustrous leaves and clusters of pale bell-shaped flowers in spring and early summer. And the plant hunting tradition continues. Nigel has just returned from a collecting trip to Yunnan in China. And who knows which of those seeds he's brought back in his pocket will join these Japanese maples as the classic plants of the future. You begin to wonder whether there wasn't some kind of competition for the best new plant introductions, a kind of keeping up with the Joneses among garden owners. Down the road from Chiverton, there's another garden with special traditions of pioneer breeding, Trewithen.
The house was built during the period of 1715, so the end of Queen Anne's reign, right through to 1760. But at the time the house was built and completed, so we're talking about 1750, 1760, the grounds would have been laid out in a very formal and very planned way. And so great vistas and avenues radiating everywhere down to the lake, which is still there now. And the garden, the actual garden you see now, came very, very much later. It really came with the arrival of my grandfather here at Trewithen. Many introductions here were the result of generosity, actually, by John Charles Williams, J.C. Williams, because Julian Williams of Cahays, the great plantsman of today, was my grandfather's godson, and so there's always been a great link between the two families. And so it was J.C. Williams and his generosity that allowed a lot of original plant material to come here. But there were a lot of other introductions, and I'm thinking of names like Lobb and Veitch and Wilson and Forrest, all those sort of people. So there were a lot of plants, and we still get plants sent to us now too.
Another magnolia that wouldn't fit into your average back garden. It's Magnolia Campbelli mollicamata, over 20 metres high here, towering over house and lawn. But here's one you can grow, even in a tiny garden, Magnolia liliflora. It flowers at the same time as its big brother. But unlike Magnolia Campbelli, you don't get these gorgeous furry buds. A refreshing change from all that Cornish naturalism is a formal area. In fact, it's the only section of the garden that's contemporary with the home. It used to be a herb garden, suitable for planting on a small scale and protected by walls and by the trees that grow beyond.
To me, one of the most lovely trees here, because it's tactile, and I would think a tree has to be tactile. It's not just to be looked at, you need to feel it. And that's a tree called Stewartia sinensis. Which is a glorious tree. It has tiny little pinpricks of flower, but the leaf and the bark is quite spectacular, and the trunk looks rather like an elephant's foot with great sort of wriggles of skin all the way around it, and is a wonderful tree to touch. This is the species of birch. It's actually called Betula sinensis maximoweezii. Now that's an unpronounceable name almost, named after a missionary, Père Maximovic, who was a Frenchman. And this introduction from China arrived in Europe in the middle of last century, I believe it was, and is a very, very rare tree indeed. But again, you'll see, rather like the Stewartia sinensis we looked at earlier, how the bark is shed, and I always like to think the tree likes itself being peeled to encourage next year's growth, and so here you have it. Something else which people can see at this time of the year when they're coming into the garden is Styrax japonica, which is particularly sweetly scented, The bees love it, and there's a wonderfully shaped tree, pendulous form, a lovely specimen, I think.
From what we've seen so far, you might think that all Cornish gardeners lived in stately homes with magnificent grounds. But in such a perfect climate, almost everybody's keen. So it isn't surprising that so many people want to come to the Cornwall Garden Society's Spring Show, celebrating its centenary this year at Heligan. After enjoying the sights and sounds, and particularly the fragrances of the show, there's time to sit down and reflect and perhaps develop ideas.
Gardens are dynamic things, constantly developing in the hands of loving owners. But what happens if ownership changes? So often gardens can die from neglect. Well, the National Trust has taken over at least 8 major gardens in Cornwall, and under their supervision, those gardens will continue to develop in the future.
Up country near Bodmin, Lanhydrock harks back to the 17th century, where gardening consisted of ordered flower beds, hard lines and geometry.
The 7th Lord Clifton gave Lanhydrock to the National Trust in 1953, and in the following year we had 700 visitors in the months April to October. This year we shall probably have 170,000, or possibly even more, and so if Lord Clifton and his sisters were to return, I'm sure they'd be amazed at the vast increase in the number of people that were coming to enjoy their house and grounds. Repeat visits are always made to the gardens. People might go to the houses once, possibly twice, but they think they don't really change or alter. But obviously there's always something different in the gardens, and so we do get an appreciable number of repeat visits. I suppose one of the main problems is really on the lawns. As we get increasingly large numbers of feet trampling over them, we do have to spend a great deal more time and effort on lawn maintenance, and particularly on the edges of lawns. And here at Lanhydrock there's a very good example of granite edging being put around some of the lawns to protect them. The formal parterre at Lanhydrock was laid out in 1857, but has been sort of simplified over subsequent generations. But the plants, certainly in some parts of the parterre, are replanted twice every year, and generally follows sort of historical colour schemes. The family here were very keen liberals, and so very often there are sort of orange flowers amongst the plants that are chosen. Historically, the Cornish gardens were very much orientated towards the spring, partly because of the climate, and also because many of the great families that owned these houses went away during the summer. They were doing other things in London or perhaps in Scotland, so they only really needed to see their gardens in the early part of the year. But increasingly our visitors come in the height of the season, in July and August, and so we have adapted some of the gardens to provide more floral interest in the height of the season. I would say that we were trying to conserve our gardens. We certainly like to try and keep them in the spirit in which they were originally given to us, but inevitably as visitor numbers change or as new plants are introduced, things do alter, because gardens are dynamic things. They don't just stay moribund and in the past, they do continually develop.
On the banks of the River Tamar that separates Cornwall from England, as the Cornish would say, the ancient buildings of Cornwall, centuries-old home of the Edgecombe family, but surrounded by gardens that are rather more recent. Another fine garden restored by the Trust for posterity.
There was no garden when the house was first built. It was purely practical. They'd have had orchards, small holdings. coming right up to the walls of the house, right under the very windows. The first big push on the gardening came in, I think it was 1860 to 1862, when the house was revamped a little. The valley garden was laid out. This garden that we're stood in here was laid out in what was probably an old walled orchard. There was a pond and borders put in. And then it all sort of went quiet until the trust took over, which was in 1946. And since then, there's been a lot of thought put into the garden, and what you can see now has developed in the 50 years since the trust have had Coat Hill. When the house was built, they had no concept of gardening as we know it, so they weren't necessarily looking for a good site for a garden. The house was built in a convenient position, I should imagine. And so the garden at Coat Hill is quite exposed. A lot of it faces north and east, and it's very open to cold winds from that direction. We're well protected from the south and west, where the normal run of Cornish weather comes from, the strong wet gales that we get. But we are rather vulnerable or susceptible to cold winter winds, and so it does limit the range of plants I can grow here at Coat Hill. If people expect a Cornish garden full of banana trees and very tender plants, Coat Hill isn't the place they're going to find those. But on the other hand, we have got a very favourable climate here. We get lots of rain. The ground is naturally very damp anyway. There's a lot of springs running, and trees and shrubs in particular grow very quickly, particularly in the valley garden lower down. So we can grow a good range of interesting plants, but perhaps not encompassing some of the more tender plants that you'll find further south in Cornwall. One of the nice things about Coat Hill, with all its courtyards and angles, is that there are so many different microclimates, if you like, on the walls. We've got sunny, dry walls, windy, shady, you name it. So if you've got a particular climbing plant, I can usually find a wall for it, the ideal wall for it somewhere. We call it the upper garden. It was apparently originally designed as an Italian garden, but since then it's become more of an informal series of herbaceous borders. We've worked to a colour scheme. We've got gold and silver borders over against the yew hedges, and this one is really just a late summer colourful border.
Well, sadly, with changing times, and especially at the turn of the century, some gardens really did fall through the net and were lost. Almost. Here's one that managed to be rescued. Tim Smith with the story of Heligan.
I arrived here on February the 16th, 1990. We broke in with John Willis, whose mother's maiden name was Tremaine. He had recently inherited the estate, and he was very depressed about it because it was in a very poor state. And we cut our way in with machetes, which is a bit of a surprise for me as a garden visit. And we saw a few things, but it's very hard now with the passage of time to convey to you exactly how overgrown it was. I mean, the brambles were 5 metres high. They were thick as your thumb as well. There was 3 weeks prior to our arrival here, we'd had the Cornish hurricane in January of 1990. And although we didn't know it then, our later survey showed that we'd lost more than 700 trees over 60 feet in height. It was an enormous damage. So we saw, I think, the Wishing Well, a grotto, and we eventually came to the brick-built wall garden with an old door in it, and we broke our way through, and inside was this huge vinery. And it was covered in brambles, but yet underneath all the brambles was this vine that was still sort of resolutely fighting death. It was thick as your arm. And I know it sounds slushy, but I fell in love with it and decided to restore it, which is a bit of a crazy thing to do because at that time I couldn't hardly tell you the difference between a laurel and a rhododendron.
Heligan's become so well known that it's often hard to appreciate just what a huge achievement the restoration has been. It takes imagination, courage, vision, and quite a lot of money to make a dream like this come true. But the good news about Heligan is that the story continues. Heligan's horticultural consultant is Philip Macmillan Browse.
Well, the Lost Gardens of Heligan effectively are a simple valley garden as you would find almost in any Cornish garden around the south coast or running down to the Helford River. And we have large quantities of tree ferns, rhododendrons, the odd magnolia, which you'd expect to find. But the essential difference of why Heligan is different, apart from its recent history, is because we have re-established and maintain the productive gardens in a fashion which would have been relevant to the big house at the end of the last century. So we're producing vegetables, we're producing fruit, we're producing cut flowers, herbs, medicinal plants, you name it, everything that the sort of sustained horticulture would have required at the time to feed and maintain the house. All the operations in it are hand done. We do no machinery at all because Victorians didn't have tractors or rotavators, did they? Apart from the fact that, of course, by hand cultivation you maintain far better soil conditions. But also our varieties that we grow are all Victorian or early Edwardian. We have nothing much that is beyond 1905, and certainly virtually nothing that's post-First World War in terms of the varieties we grow. And then everything is put into the complex rotational systems that you require to maintain soil fertility and make use of the various systems of soil management that you use, so that you would have within the vegetable garden a 4-year, 5-course rotation, and then that takes care of the annual vegetables and flowers. And then you would have a short-term rotation which does things like asparagus, rhubarb, artichokes, strawberries, which rotate maybe over a few year cycle. And then they again rotate with the soft fruit bed, which may have a life of 15 years.
If I'm allowed to boast, you will see the finest vegetable garden in Europe. You will see all our productive houses in production, because as far as we're concerned, heritage is only of interest if you can restore it to function. Putting history in aspic is of no interest at all. You'll see peaches in the peach house, you'll see pineapples in our manure-heated pineapple beds. I don't think there's any others in the world like it.
The dung is brought into the yard first, and then it's all got to be wheelbarrowed in at one end. This back pit takes about 40 tons of dung to fill in one go. The fermentation of the dung, that can reach temperatures of 140 Fahrenheit, and that heat comes in through the air bricks into this cavity wall and into the actual growing pits. This is the first time that we've had pineapples in flower here for at least 100 years, and under this method we're probably the first time for about 150 years.
This is a restoration that we started in the autumn of 1995, and it's known as the Sundial Garden or Mrs. Tremain's Flower Garden. And we know it was an important flower garden because it's mentioned in an article in the Gardener's Chronicle in 1896. Now, the problem in the restoration of this garden was in what plants we were going to put in the herbaceous border in order to restore it to be some sort of period. And that sort of period suggests Gertrude Jekyll, and I had thought to myself that if I tried to design or get somebody to design a Gertrude Jekyll border, the immediate reaction from all the cognoscenti would be, oh, well, they've got that colour in the wrong place or that plant in the wrong place, because everybody's familiar and it's all written about. So we decided to put our herbaceous border plan, and based on plants that were available in 1885, which makes it more interesting, but it also avoids the criticisms we might otherwise get, because 1885 flower gardens are not really well documented.
You've got to capture the spirit of place, and if you can capture somehow what was motivating the people who were constructing the gardens in the first place, you should follow that. You should have the faith to follow your nose. It's extraordinary. People talk about period correctness. We are period correct in certain ways, but the strange thing is that by being period correct, I think what people really mean is, does it feel right? It's often a strange reflection that you put a plant in that is a modern plant, and for some reason its colouring or foliage just doesn't seem right. It's nothing to do with period, it just doesn't feel right. And I think that's the way these gardens were developed by the guys who were building them up. I know John Claude Tremaine was experimenting all the time to try and get an effect of jungleness in the main subtropical garden. He wasn't sitting there saying, oh, well, can't have any more plants coming in. He was scouring the seed catalogues and the plant importation catalogue. As far as he was concerned, this was a magnificent living theatre, and this was his stage. And that is what I believe in. I think it's I've said it before, and it's a bit dull, but if you can't, make love in it, get drunk in it, or dream in it, what's the point of having it? Tarmac it.
Well, so far we've been looking at wide expanses and grand rolling coombes down to the sea, But here at Lamorren, we're in a small, intimate garden, and just look at this. A little rock garden planted with aeoniums from Morocco, century plant from Central America, prickly pears from Mexico, and bright orange gazanias from South Africa. Now, you could grow all these in a small rock garden at home, but unless you happen to live in Cornwall, you would have to have them in a greenhouse or a conservatory. Most of these would not survive winters outdoors. But here, we've got blue sky overhead, and it's a perfect planting for a small space.
It may be on the Atlantic, but Lamorren is the very essence of a Mediterranean garden, perhaps of the 1920s. I say 1920s, but this garden is actually very recent and shows just how dynamic the art form of gardening still is in this county. When you walk along its steep terraces furnished with subtropical plants, you might be taking a stroll down the Grande Corniche. Well, you can't have a Mediterranean garden without palm trees, and the collection here is remarkable. It consists mainly of the Chusan palm, Trachycarpus fortunei, a hardy Chinese species, but one which gives a truly tropical effect.
When I first came down, I'd been very much a rhododendron and evergreen azalea man, and I brought quite a large collection. So they formed, if you like, the base to the garden. From that, as we lived down here, I found that the climate was so benign that we could try other things. And apart from one frost in '87 and another one this last year in '97, we've been virtually frost-free, and that's enabled an enormous range of plants, particularly Southern Hemisphere plants, South African, Australian, Chilean plants to be grown in the garden, in addition to the more ordinary plants that one would expect to find. The garden was very much on a south-facing hillside, and the gradient increases the further you go away from the house. Therefore, in a way, there was only one way to deal with it, and that was to crisscross paths rather than go down in straight lines. I have to say that we've created quite a lot of artificial landscapes, so whilst the idea was originally that, we have taken it from there and enlarged upon it. But very much the garden is meandering paths winding down the hillside to the bottom, to the open vista out to sea at the very bottom of the garden. I find it a very restful place, and it's become a spiritual home very much, Cornwall and this part of Cornwall, and I couldn't really think of living anywhere else in England other than down here in the very benign climate that we have. Yes.
Most of the gardens we've looked at so far have benefited from considerable resources, but Lally and William Croggan have restored an old rectory garden at Creed entirely on their own. They started by removing no fewer than 300 unwanted trees, and then went on to exploit the garden's natural attributes.
Well, it's a natural spring, and we are very lucky indeed. I mean, it's just every gardener's dream. It doesn't matter that it's the tiniest trickle of a stream. It feeds about 3 ponds, and you can grow such marvellous plants. It's all the wonderful shapes and forms that grow around a pond. It's just a perfect scene. You paint a palette with your irises and your rounds of the big bold hosta leaves, and this lovely water mimulus. And I especially adore Solomon seal. It's such an architectural plant, and its quiet green beauty. I always love a garden with a vista. It looks as if it goes on forever. And then I suddenly realised we could do a vista here. I'm absolutely crazy about trees, and we're lucky enough to have enough garden here to be able to plant trees. And we have also particularly planted for autumn colour, because Cornwall, being a windy county, is not noted for its autumn colour. But we have found that by planting things like Cercidiphyllum, tulip tree, liquid amber, Nyssa sylvatica, we have the most amazing display of autumn colours that go in a wonderful succession throughout the autumn, and it's a great joy. This is a tree I'm absolutely crazy about. Just look at its marvellous silver new growth, the underside of the leaves, and it's quite incredible navy blue fir cones. What could be more beautiful? It's called Abies Koreana, from Korea, I suppose. This is the same water that comes from the little trickle stream right at the top of the garden. We let it flow over what we rather grandly call Creed Falls, and there we catch it and put it underground to a lily pond halfway down the side of the garden, and the overspill comes into this bog garden where we have the opportunity to grow skunk cabbage and these lovely shuttlecock ferns, which I adore, another architectural plant, and I would like to make a collection of more lovely ferns. Oh, and of course, please don't forget the star of the show, this lovely Acer dissectum aureum. I absolutely adore this spot of a summer's evening when the sun is slanting in its rays. I love the lay of the land and the formation of the trees, especially that horizontal cornice against the Pottenii, the upright evergreen. And then further down, it's all lovely frothy leaves. And across the valley, the fields on the opposite side and the lovely countryside behind.
Headland is the next in our look at smaller gardens, aptly named as it clings to the rocky entrance to the Foy River at Polruan. With water on three sides, it's probably more suited to a fisherman than a gardener. You've got to be especially dedicated to your hobby to create a garden in these conditions.
I didn't really realise when we came here what it was going to be like. We came from a garden that was down in a valley and no wind, but other difficulties. When we came here, it was a long time before we really got the first gale. And I found then that I had to study what the plants were doing. When we started to take away some of the undergrowth that had grown up over the years, various things started breaking. The plants that do well are the ones on the whole that have smallish, thick leaves. The grey leaf plants are good on the whole, and some of the yellow-leaved.
Like a lot of Cornish gardeners, Jean has discovered that trees like Cupressus macrocarpa, the Monterey cypress, stand up well to the salt winds. And if you want variety, you can always choose the golden form rather than the green. Prostrate plants are more likely to keep their heads below the wind than upright ones.
Salt-tolerant plants that we grow on this side of the garden, you see those palms do well. We've got the Escalonia, which loves it, the Buddleia. We've got the Erigeron, that grows quite naturally in the cliffs. That was here when we came, and it seeds itself. And we've got things like the Hottentot fig, you know, the Carpobrotus there, and the Lampranthus. They all are very happy. And the funny thing is the succulent plants will withstand the wind better than some of the other plants that you would think would do better. We get a lot of different sorts of weather. Might be blowing a gale in the morning and then it will die right down and then we'll have it's beautiful weather. Might be pouring with rain in the morning. It drains away so quickly that it's lovely and dry by the afternoon. Well, it can be the other way around, of course.
You can't build a windbreak on a slope of 45 degrees, so Jean overcomes this by concentrating her planting in small hollows and crevices. You can instantly tell how successful this has been by the way the plants have naturalised, spreading themselves over the bedrock, merging together to paint a natural tapestry with different colours and textures.
It's a challenge. And I do enjoy being so near the sea. I would miss it very much. I had to go and live inland. I couldn't swim, I couldn't paddle, I couldn't go down a beach comb. And you get very conscious of the water when you live close to it.
It'd be a shame to leave Cornwall without visiting at least one town garden, so why not head for the capital, the cathedral city, Truro, where Wendy and Mike Perry have made Bosvigo House their home.
Well, really, we've created a series of outdoor rooms. So they should be pleasant to sit in, to be in. using old-fashioned cottage garden plants, colour controlled, so you don't have a nasty shock. Having said that, some bits of the garden are planted with very vibrant colours, but they're all grouped together. We're standing in the walled garden that we created about 15 years ago by pulling off a wing of the house, an enormous great ballroom, again to create an enclosed space, like a picture frame, so that your borders have the walls behind them with climbers, gives you extra display space with climbers, roses, clematis, and then the borders are filled with old-fashioned campanulas, violas, Japanese anemones, asters, always something to see from May until the end of September, often into October and November.
At this time of the year, the best thing are these lovely ligularia, the rocket. Lovely slender spires of yellow, trails of little yellow stars shooting up into the sky with a lovely black stem. Then in front of the ligularia there you have Monarda Cambridge scarlet. That's called the bergamot, I believe. Then you've got the lovely brown foliage of Lysomycia there, ciliata, firecracker. Wendy's cut the yellow flowers off now, they've finished, but still a lovely foliage. And then coming down to the front here, we've got that wonderful dahlia, Bednall Beauty. 2 foot high, doesn't need any support. Wonderful red, and that super dark foliage. At the back is the sort of centrepiece. You can see the big rheum, big giant rhubarb thing there. That one's called Red Herald. Lovely red stems. Behind that there's a berberis, I can't remember which one. But again you can see the big acer there, Crimson King. Really a horrid thing, but still nice foliage. Again purple to hold everything down, otherwise this yellow and orange and red would take over and be just too much.
Shrubs rule in Cornwall, okay, but not at Bosfigo. We have used just a lot of the perennial plants, and they give good value. They come up each year, usually requiring not much trouble, a little bit of staking perhaps. They flower their hearts out in quite a small space. The camellia takes up an enormous space, but not a campanula, and it still has the flower power that a camellia does.
I think the Veen garden is one of my favourites because it's a small garden that anybody could do in their front garden, and there's a lovely balance, a lovely harmony there between the structure, the very rigid square pattern, and the lushness of Wendy's planting, and of course her control of colour.
About 28 miles out to sea that way, you might expect the pattern of rocks and islands known as the Scillies to be bleak and desolate, but there are some delightful islands out there. And Tresco, formerly inhabited by Benedictine monks, has one of the finest gardens in Cornwall, the Abbey Gardens, full of exotic delights, undisputed jewel in the crown of Cornwall.
We're right in the heart of the garden here. This is where everything started 160 years ago. If you can imagine a bare island devoid of trees and shrubs, and behind me the old abbey had a wall built around it and plants were put in from all over the southern hemisphere, and then the garden expanded from there. Augustus Smith, the man who started the garden, found that by cutting out the wind, which is the most important factor here, he could grow these tropical plants. So each succeeding member of the family actually enlarged the garden in their own way and brought plants from different regions of the world. It's not that we get very hot in the summer, it's the fact that we don't get very cold in the winter. We've got the Gulf Stream that comes across, and with the warm air currents and the protection from the wind and salt spray, our range of plants is unique. We have palms from the Canary Islands, palms from Australia, plants from South Africa that live on the Cape and are used to wind and salt spray, and those plants can sit up in the teeth of the gale and not turn a hair. This plant we're looking at here is one of the South African proteas. They grow at the Cape of South Africa, and they have the sort of peculiarity of growing in very poor soil and a tenderness to frost. So you'll see these nowhere else in Britain growing outside. We have about 30 to 40 different species, also allied very closely to the leucodendrons and the leucospermum. And with us they flower all the year round, with these lovely spectacular flowers ranging anything up to a foot across. This is probably the most majestic tree we have here on Tresco. It's a small plant of Metrosideros excelsa, the New Zealand Christmas tree. And here on Tresco it grows anything up to 80 to 90 foot tall. It's an evergreen, but in July it's covered in these wonderful red flowers. Now if you thought you had problems weeding, take a look at this. This is Echium pininiana from the Canary Islands. It's a biannual. It grows anything up to 15 foot in just over 12 months. You can see these lovely blue flowers all the way down the flower spike. And then here, this is this year's seedling plant, which started in March and already is up to 4 or 5 foot high and will produce next year one of these. Here we have a typical island wall. You can see the Aeonium from the Canary Islands with its flower, South African Lampranthus here with 2 colours, but anything on Tresco up to 30 different varieties and species, running across to Agapanthus. Now Agapanthus you actually grow on the mainland quite easily, but here you have them as weeds growing on walls and right through the sand dunes.
Even a natural paradise like Tresco can be taken by surprise by the weather. Frost is almost unheard of, but when it does come, the devastation is extensive. Recently, a severe gale destroyed many of the sheltering trees, leaving large areas vulnerable. But out of that devastation came inspiration for this new Italian garden. Still very young, still searching for its character, but a new chapter in the story of Cornwall's gardens.